The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the parking lot of a large supermarket in Texas. The automatic doors slid open, revealing a bustling scene inside. The steady hum of shopping carts rolling across the tile floor, the rhythmic beeping of barcode scanners, and the lively chatter of families and friends. The aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the scent of ripe produce. Jamal, a black man in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, walked into the store with a quiet confidence. He wore a simple gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and a pair of well-worn but clean sneakers. In one hand, he held his phone, while the other gripped a shopping basket filled with a few essentials: a gallon of milk, a bag of fresh greens, and a box of cereal for breakfast. Near the meat counter, Eleanor, a white woman in her mid-70s, examined packages of ground beef. She wore a light-colored knit cardigan, her silver hair neatly pinned up, but her face carried a look of mild irritation. She frowned as she scanned the shelves, muttering something under her breath. Jamal moved toward the frozen section nearby, reaching for a pack of chicken breasts. At that exact moment, Eleanor extended her hand as well, accidentally brushing against him. A brief silence hung in the air, but no one could have predicted that in just moments, the atmosphere in the store would shift entirely. The accidental touch lasted less than a second, but the reaction was immediate. Eleanor stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. She pulled her hand back sharply, as if she had touched something unpleasant. Her pale blue eyes locked onto Jamal, scanning him with an expression that was hard to misinterpret: disdain, suspicion, maybe even something darker. Jamal barely had time to process the subtle but unmistakable shift in her demeanor before she spoke, her voice laced with irritation. "People like you don't belong here," she said, her tone loud enough to turn a few nearby heads. Jamal froze. His grip tightened around the pack of chicken, his pulse quickening. Had he really just heard that? A middle-aged man browsing the seafood section glanced up, his brow furrowing. A young mother with a toddler shifted uncomfortably, gripping her son's hand a little tighter. The air in the store grew heavier, thick with a tension that crackled like static before a storm. Eleanor didn't stop there. Straightening her cardigan, she raised her chin slightly, her voice growing bolder. "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" This time, the words hit like a slap. A stunned silence settled over the aisle. Even the distant beeping of cash registers seemed to fade into the background. Jamal took a slow, measured breath. Every instinct in his body urged him to react, to snap back, to demand an apology, to let his anger rise to the surface. But he didn't, not yet. Instead, he straightened his posture, rolling his shoulders back, his expression unreadable, the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone around them. A young cashier, barely out of her teens, stopped stacking boxes and stared, her hands frozen in place. An older man near the bread aisle shifted his feet, looking from Eleanor to Jamal as if deciding whether to step in. Jamal studied Eleanor for a moment, searching her face for any sign of hesitation, any hint that she realized the gravity of what she had just said. But there was none, only defiance. He could walk away. Ignore her, let her words fester in the air, unchallenged. But something inside him refused to let that happen. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the pack of chicken into his basket. Then, locking eyes with Eleanor, he spoke, his voice calm but unyielding. "Ma'am, do you even hear yourself?" Jamal's words hung in the air, steady and deliberate, slicing through the thick silence like a blade. His voice wasn't raised, but the weight behind it was undeniable. The tension in the aisle tightened like a coiled spring. Eleanor scoffed, gripping her shopping cart with trembling hands. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice sharp, defensive. "This is my country. People like you." She trailed off, but the meaning was clear enough. A sharp inhale came from somewhere behind them. A woman near the dairy section pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief. A young employee restocking shelves hesitated, torn between stepping in and staying out of something that felt far bigger than a simple grocery store altercation. Jamal didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed to grow taller, his presence expanding to fill the space between them. He exhaled slowly, shifting his basket to his other hand. His composure was unshaken, but his patience was wearing thin. "All right," he said, nodding. Slowly, as if giving Eleanor one last chance to think about her words. "Since you brought it up, let's talk about that." The store felt like it had come to a standstill. Even the soft hum of the refrigerator seemed muted. Jamal took a step forward, not aggressively, but with purpose. His gaze never wavered from Eleanor's. "You say I don't belong here. But let me tell you something about where I come from." His voice was calm, but there was fire beneath the surface. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Georgia. He worked land he didn't own, laboring under a system that saw him as less than human. His father, a slave. Stolen from his home, beaten. Sold like cattle to help build this very country you claim as yours." A murmur rippled through the crowd that had gathered, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. "My grandfather fought in World War II, risked his life overseas, only to come back to a country that treated him like a second-class citizen. Couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed because he believed in the promise of this nation, even when it didn't believe in him." Eleanor's face paled. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her cart. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. Jamal's voice softened, but his words carried even more weight. "So tell me again, ma'am, who exactly doesn't belong here?" A heavy silence followed Jamal's words, stretching across the grocery store like an invisible force pressing down on everyone in earshot. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the distant chatter from the registers seemed to have faded, as if the entire store was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her face, once flushed with righteous indignation, was now a shifting storm of emotions, anger, disbelief, and something deeper, something unspoken. Shame, perhaps. She gripped the handle of her cart so tightly her knuckles turned white, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the moment. Then, from somewhere in the gathered crowd, a voice broke the silence. "He's right." A man in a baseball cap, middle-aged, weathered, the kind of guy you'd expect to see at a Sunday barbecue, stepped forward. His tone was firm, but not unkind. "We gotta be better than this." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. A woman near the frozen foods section nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "My dad fought in that same war. He always said the only colors that mattered were the red, white, and blue." The tide was turning. A young cashier at the end of the aisle, barely out of her teens, hesitated before speaking up. "I've never seen anyone handle something like that with so much grace. Thank you." Her voice was small, but sincere. Eleanor swallowed hard, her hands trembling now. She looked around, as if searching for an ally, someone who would nod in agreement, validate her anger, but there was no one. The fire in her eyes dimmed, flickering under the weight of the moment. She opened her mouth once more, but this time her voice was quieter, almost uncertain. "I didn't mean," she started, but stopped herself. Jamal studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice softer than before, but just as firm, he said, "It's not about what you meant. It's about how it came across. Words matter. And so do actions." The weight of his statement lingered, settling into the space between them. Then, slowly, deliberately, a man near the deli counter began to clap. It was hesitant at first, uncertain. But then another joined in, and another, until the quiet applause swelled into something undeniable. Eleanor's face paled. Without another word, she turned, gripping her cart and wheeling it toward the exit. As she disappeared down the aisle, A woman placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saying what needed to be said." As the last echoes of applause faded, the grocery store gradually returned to its usual rhythm, carts rolling, registers beeping, quiet conversations resuming. Yet, something had undeniably changed. The air still carried the weight of what had just happened, as if the moment refused to be brushed aside like an insignificant encounter. People stole glances at Jamal, some offering nods of respect, others a lingering look of contemplation. The young cashier, still at her register, smiled faintly at him as he stepped toward the checkout. Jamal exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the basket in his hand. He hadn't planned for any of this. He hadn't walked into the store expecting to stand in the face of open ignorance and challenge it. But as he replayed the encounter in his mind, he knew one thing for certain: silence had never been an option. As he placed his groceries on the conveyor belt, he noticed Eleanor through the glass doors. She was sitting in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her gaze distant. For a brief moment, he considered walking over, giving her one last word, one last chance at understanding, but something held him back. Some lessons he knew took time to settle. He had already said what needed to be said. The rest was up to her. Outside, the evening sun stretched long shadows across the parking lot. Jamal loaded his groceries into his car, his mind still sifting through the weight of the moment. It wasn't about winning or proving a point. It was about making sure the truth was heard. He could only hope that, in the quiet of her car, Eleanor was hearing it now. Later that night, Jamal sat at the kitchen table across from his father, recounting the encounter. His father, a man of few words but deep wisdom, listened intently. His fingers interlocked as he nodded along. When Jamal finished, his father let a pause linger before speaking. "You did the right thing, son," he said finally. "Not just for yourself, for everyone who was watching, for the ones who didn't know how to stand up, and maybe even for her." Jamal nodded, his father's words settling deep. Across town, Eleanor sat at her own kitchen table, staring at an untouched plate of food. Her hands rested in her lap, her mind circling back to everything Jamal had said. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar crack in. Certainty, a seed of doubt. Sometimes change didn't happen in grand gestures. Sometimes it started with a moment that refused to be forgotten. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened at the grocery store spread throughout the neighborhood. It wasn't just idle gossip, it was a conversation that refused to fade, igniting discussions in coffee shops, at dinner tables, and even among strangers in line at the very same store. People spoke of Jamal's composure, his unwavering dignity, in the face of ignorance. Some admitted they weren't sure what they would have done in his place. Others realized they had been silent bystanders too many times before. For Jamal, life continued as usual: work, errands, time with his family, but there was an undeniable shift. A few days after the incident, as he walked into a local cafe, a middle-aged man in a flannel jacket stopped him near the counter. "Hey, I just wanted to say, what you did back there, it mattered," the man said, rubbing the back of his neck as if unsure of his words. "My grandfather fought in that same war, and I grew up hearing stories about how we were all supposed to be equal, but I guess I never really thought about what that meant for everybody. You gave me something to think about." Jamal nodded, offering a small but sincere smile. He hadn't done what he did for recognition, but moments like these reminded him that words had weight, that standing up even just once could ripple outward in ways he hadn't expected. Across town, Eleanor found herself unable to shake the conversation she had with Jamal. His words had followed her home, lingered in the quiet spaces of her mind. She had spent years believing the things she said that day, believing they were simple truths rather than harmful prejudices. But something about the way he spoke, with calm, with undeniable history, made her question herself in a way she never had before. One morning, as she sat at her dining table, she reached for the phone. She hesitated before dialing, but eventually, the call went through. "Claire," she said to her daughter on the other end, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Tell me again about those books you wanted me to read, the ones about history." Her daughter was stunned into silence for a moment. But then, Eleanor heard a quiet, hopeful exhale. "I'll send you a list, Mom," Claire said. "I think that's a great idea." Sometimes, change didn't happen all at once. Sometimes it started with a crack, a question, a willingness to listen. And that was enough. Weeks passed, but the echoes of that afternoon in the grocery store did not fade. Jamal went about his daily life, not expecting anything more to come of it, but he noticed small changes. Strangers nodded at him in quiet respect, a few even stopping to shake his hand. The young cashier from that day smiled whenever she saw him, her posture a little straighter, as if she had gained confidence from witnessing his strength. But the most unexpected change came in the form of a letter. One evening, as Jamal sorted through his mail, his fingers paused over an envelope with shaky handwriting. Inside was a short note, written on delicate stationery. "Jamal, I don't know if you'll read this, but I wanted to say, I'm sorry, you were right. Words matter and mine were cruel. I can't erase them, but I can learn. I hope one day I can tell you this in person. Eleanor." Jamal exhaled slowly, reading the note twice. He hadn't expected an apology, and certainly not from her. Yet, here it was a sign that maybe, just maybe, something had shifted. He set the letter down, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Sometimes, change wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet decision to be better than yesterday. And in that moment, Jamal knew he had done more than just stand his ground that day. He had planted a seed. The story of Jamal and Eleanor is a reminder that change often begins in the most unexpected places. It teaches us that how we respond to ignorance and hatred matters just as much as the message we try to convey. Anger may feel justified, but dignity and composure have the power to break barriers and reach hearts. This story also highlights the importance of self-reflection. Eleanor's growth didn't happen instantly, but a single conversation planted the seed for transformation. It reminds us that it's never too late to unlearn prejudice and choose understanding instead. In our daily lives, we must have the courage to speak up when we witness injustice. But just as importantly, we must be willing to listen, to learn, and to grow. Real change doesn't happen overnight, but every act of kindness, every moment of truth, and every willingness to see beyond bias brings us one step closer to a more compassionate world.